My name is April, and I grew up here in Michigan in the Detroit area. I would like to explain to you a little bit about my background. I do not know how I became deaf. My mother was a single mom, and whether or not I was born deaf is not known. When I was born, I had no official language. We just communicated as best we could by pointing and a little bit of babbling and such. I was about 3 years old. I can't remember the exact age, but I was in the kitchen and I was playing on the kitchen floor. And my mom was also in the kitchen at the time. She was making a meal. She was kind of clanging pots and pans and making some noise. She accidentally dropped some of the pots and pans and they made a huge crash. But that didn't faze me. I continued playing on the floor with my toys. My mother noticed this, that she hadn't provoked a reaction from me with the loud noise, and thought it was rather strange that I hadn't responded. Shortly thereafter, my mother took me into the doctor and I was tested, and we realized that I was deaf. This news shocked my mother, and she did not know how to respond. She had no information about what it meant to be deaf or hard of hearing and everything that went along with being labeled deaf. She was unsure of what to do with me now that she knew I was deaf, and was kind of stumped, rather puzzled with everything that it would entail. She began to worry about what schools I would attend, and our doctor at the time recommended that we try the local kindergarten school. It had a preschool program, and the doctor said that I could be enrolled in that program. At that time, my mother and I lived in Groves Point, Michigan, and I was the only deaf child in the area. And my mom felt kind of stuck. She didn't know what to do. So my mother went ahead and put me in the preschool program at the local kindergarten, and I was the only deaf student at the time. All of the other children were hearing. The first day of school, the teacher stood in front of the class and realized that I was the only deaf student, and she sort of struggled with how she would be able to communicate with me and how she could teach me. After that, the teacher decided to let my mother know I could no longer attend that school in that program. Her reason was that because I was the only deaf child, I was different from the other hearing children, and it wasn't going to work out. My mother protested this, and she said that I, could communicate and make it through, but to no avail. My mother then went through a time of some frustration trying other options for my education. Finally, my mother found out about the Detroit Day School for the Deaf. It wasn't far from my home, it was within commuting distance. So my mother had no other option. She thought, why not? Let's give it a shot. It was one of the best choices for me. I continued to attend the school and continued the commute to and from. When I was about 7 years old is the time I would say my language skills began to really develop. I began to sign with my mother. It wasn't ASL, it was a more English form of signing, but at least it was communication. At first, communication between my mother and I was a little rocky. There was a lot of miscommunication, a lot of frustration involved in the process. But with some time, we were finally be able to develop a communication strategy with signing together, and my mother was willing to learn, and that's when my language skills really started when I was about 7. I continued to attend the Detroit Day School until my graduation. When After my graduation, I then went to MSSD. Upon entering MSSD, it was a huge culture shock for me. I experienced deaf culture for the first time and rapidly acquired ASL skills. After being at MSSD for a while, I had the chance to visit my mother back home, and she was amazed at the change she saw in me and my language use. She was shocked at how well I used ASL and had to keep asking me to slow down. At that point, I explained to her that I had found my cultural identity and I was now identified myself as being deaf. Growing up, I had always identified myself as hard of hearing. I could hear music, I could speak well enough, and I could kind of experience some of the things that go along with hearing culture. But now that had kind of gone by the wayside, that part of my life had come to an end. And now I am culturally deaf. That is my identity. And that's my story about growing up.